On a hillside, in the deep hours after sunset, an old man is asleep, but it is not an ordinary sleep. The old book that tells his story calls it a horror of great darkness, falling over him like a weight. Around him, cut into the dirt, is a trench. In it lie the halves of a heifer, a goat, and a ram split down the spine, laid open, blood pooling black in the dust. Beside them rest a dove and a young pigeon, whole, untouched, because you never split a bird for this ritual. You only ever cut it once. This old man's name is Abram, and he has done everything he was told to do. He gathered the animals. He killed them. He split them open. He arranged the halves into two facing rows with a narrow, wet path down the middle. Then he waited. And here is what he expected to happen next. He expected that he and God would walk that path together, because that is how the oldest covenant ceremony on earth worked, nearly 2,000 years before Christ. Two parties, wanting to bind themselves to a promise too serious for words alone, would slaughter animals, lay the pieces on the ground, and walk together between them. And by walking through, both sides were saying the same brutal sentence out loud without needing to speak it. If I break this promise, let what happened to these animals happen to me. Both parties. Every single time. That was the rule. Not a suggestion. Not a custom you could skip if you trusted the other side enough. It was so binding that entire kingdoms staked their survival on it, because in a world with no notaries, no courts, no paper contracts of any kind, this walk between the pieces was the closest thing anyone had to a signature that could never be denied later. But on this night, only one of them walked, and it was not Abram. Hold that thought, because we are going to come back to that path and to the one who walked it alone. Before this video ends, what happened on it that night still shapes something almost every Christian says out loud without knowing what it costs. One small, overused, understood word: promise. This is not a video about optimism. This is not a video about wishful thinking. This is not a video about a verse you put on a coffee mug next to your morning coffee. This is a video about what the word promise actually meant to the people who first wrote it down. And once you see what it meant to them, you cannot read it the soft way again. In English, a promise is mostly a feeling wearing the shape of a sentence. Someone says they'll do something, and you hope they mean it. In Hebrew, the word most often translated word is dabar. But dabar does not only mean a sound a mouth makes. A dabar is also a thing, an event, a deed already set in motion. When the God of Israel speaks a dabar, in the thinking of the people who wrote these stories down, he is not describing a future that might happen. He is releasing something into the world that now exists and is now moving toward the moment it becomes visible, whether anyone believes it yet or not. And when that kind of word takes the shape of an agreement between two parties, Hebrew has a second word for it: Berith, covenant. Here is what should stop you cold. The verb Hebrew usually pairs with Berith is not make. It's karat, to cut. Over and over in the Old Testament, when two parties strike an agreement, the literal phrase is karat berith, he cut a covenant. Not signed, not agreed. Cut. Language remembers what a promise used to cost, even after the people speaking it forget. There's one more Hebrew word worth carrying with you before we go any further, because it shows up quietly beside almost every promise in this story, holding the whole thing together from underneath. Chesed. It gets translated a dozen different ways: mercy, kindness, loving devotion, and none of them quite landed. Chesed is the loyalty you keep showing to a covenant partner even after they've given you every reason to walk away. It's not a feeling. It's a decision, renewed daily, to stay bound to a word you already cut. Keep that word in your pocket. You'll need it later. Here's what most people miss. This was not just religious poetry. Archaeologists working in the ruins of a city called Mari, on the banks of the Euphrates, uncovered clay tablets from roughly this same era, nearly 2,000 years before Christ, describing treaties where two parties slaughtered an animal and walked between the halves to seal an agreement. The ceremony in Abram's story was not a strange dream. It was the legal handshake of its Let's start at the beginning. Because the first time this God makes a promise to a human being, he does not use blood at all. He uses a bow. You know the story of Noah, even if you've never opened a Bible. The flood recedes. The earth is a drowned, silent thing. And in the clouds, something appears that Noah has almost certainly never seen before, because some scholars argue rain itself may never have fallen before that flood. A bow of color, stretched across the sky. Here's the detail almost no one tells you. The Hebrew word used for that rainbow is kesheth. And kesheth is not a poetic, invented word for arc of light. It is the ordinary Hebrew word for a weapon, a war bow, the same word used everywhere else in the Old Testament for the bow a soldier carries into battle. Which means, when God says, "I set my bow in the clouds," the picture is not decorative. It's a divine warrior, hanging up his weapon, pointed away from the earth instead of toward it. A sign so simple a child could understand it, sealing a promise that God would never again destroy the world by flood. No cutting, no blood. Just a sign, hung in the sky, visible to everyone, forever. And notice something easy to miss. This is a promise God makes with no conditions attached to it, and no human signature required. Noah doesn't cut anything. Noah doesn't swear anything. Noah simply steps off a boat onto a ruined, silent earth, and God speaks a dabar over him and every living thing with him, unconditionally. This is the gentlest rung of the ladder, and it needed to be. A traumatized survivor, standing in the wreckage of everything he'd ever known, wasn't in any position to hold up his end of a blood-cut covenant. So God didn't ask him to. That's the first rung of the ladder, a promise sealed by a sign. Now watch what happens to the second rung, because it costs a great deal more. Generations after Noah, God calls a man out of a wealthy, comfortable city called Ur, and tells him to walk toward a land he has never seen, promising him descendants as many as the dust of the earth. That man is Abram. He is not young. His wife Sarai cannot have children. And years pass. Not months. Years. The kind of years that turn a promise into a private wound you stop mentioning out loud. By the time we reach the 15th chapter of Genesis, Abram has run out of patience with waiting quietly. God comes to him in a vision, and Abram says something almost shocking in its honesty. "What good is any of this, since I still have no son? And the heir of my house is a servant born in my home." This is not the language of a man resting comfortably in faith. This is grief with a question mark at the end of it. And God's answer is not a lecture. It's an invitation outside. He takes Abram out under the open night sky and tells him to count the stars if he can. "So shall your offspring be." And here is the line that changes everything that follows. Abram believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Not because Abram had earned anything, because he simply took God's dabar, that word, already in motion, and trusted it more than he trusted what his own eyes could see. But belief is not the same thing as patience. And in the very next chapter, we watch a family try to manufacture a promise God had already spoken. Sarai, unable to conceive, gives her servant Hagar to Abram, hoping to build a family through human strategy instead of divine timing. It works, in the sense that a son named Ishmael is born, and it also fractures the household tension between Sarai and Hagar, a woman used as a means to an end and then despised for the position she was placed in. Here's the part nobody tells you. This is what happens almost every time people try to grab, by force, what God has already promised to give. The promise doesn't move faster. It just gets more complicated, and more people get hurt carrying it. Hagar herself, cast out into the wilderness later in the story, becomes the only person in the entire book of Genesis to give God a name of her own, El Roi, the God who sees me. Even inside a mess, this family built with their own hands, God does not disappear. He shows up in the wilderness for the woman nobody else was watching out for. That detail matters because it tells you something about how this God operates even when his people take a shortcut around his word. The promise keeps moving, but so does his attention to the people caught in the wreckage of trying to rush it. So, on the same night, we open this video with the night of the animals split in half. The smoking fire pot, the blazing torch Abram has already lived, through years of childless waiting and one painful, self-made shortcut. And this time, God does not simply speak a word to him. He cuts a covenant with him, karat Berith, and we already know how that ceremony should have ended. Two parties, two sets of footprints down that narrow, bloody path. We'll come back to why only one set of footprints exists. Stay with me. If you've made it this far, You're seeing something most people scroll past their whole lives without noticing that the Bible's promises aren't a flat list of nice things God says. They're a structure, getting more binding, more costly, and more personal, book by book. And there's a reason this channel keeps digging into what these words actually meant, instead of what they've come to sound like after 2,000 years of repetition. If that's the kind of study you want more of, this is a good moment to subscribe, because we're only at the second rung of 5. Let's keep climbing. Here's the pattern so far, so you don't lose the thread. A sign in the sky costs God something, but costs Noah nothing. A cutting ceremony costs a household everything it has: years, patience, one painful shortcut, and finally, animals split open in the dark. Watch what happens when the promise stops being about one family and starts being about an entire nation. Centuries after Abram, now called Abraham a Hebrew slave nation, stands at the base of a mountain called Sinai, 3 months out of Egypt. Dust from 400 years of forced labor, still on their sandals. Moses comes down from the mountain carrying words, not stone yet, that comes later, and he reads them out loud to the entire assembled nation. And the people answer with a sentence that is almost unbearable in its confidence. All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Here's what most people miss about what happens next. Moses doesn't simply nod and move on. He builds an altar. He has young men slaughter oxen as offerings. And then he does something that should stop you. He takes half the blood and throws it against the altar. And after reading the covenant again, he takes the other half of that same blood and throws it this time on the people themselves. And he says 4 words that will echo for the rest of the Bible. Behold the blood of the covenant. Not a promise sealed by a sign hanging quietly in the sky. A promise sealed by blood thrown on human skin. The stakes have climbed. This is no longer one man and his family. This is an entire nation, publicly, physically marked as bound to this word. And here's the part that makes this rung of the ladder almost unbearable to read closely. Before Moses has even carried the stone tablets back down that mountain a second time, the very people who said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do," are melting their jewelry into a golden calf and calling it their god. The blood is barely dry on their skin, and the covenant is already broken by them, not by God. If this were a contract between equals, it would have been void on the spot. But God does not walk away. He disciplines. He grieves, in the language the text uses for him. And then he renews the very same covenant, on the very same mountain, with the very same stubborn people. Kesed again, loyalty that outlasts betrayal, still bound to a word already cut. But here's where it gets stranger and more personal. Centuries later still, a shepherd boy who became a King David receives a promise through the prophet Nathan that his throne, his house, his kingdom will last forever. Not for one lifetime, forever. And David's response, recorded in his own words, is stunned humility. Who am I, O Lord God, that you have brought me thus far? There's a small wordplay tucked inside this promise that most readers never catch. David wants to build God a house, a temple, a physical building. And God answers, essentially, with a play on David's own word. You want to build me a house? Instead, I will build you a house. Not a building this time, but a dynasty, a family line that will not end. The word flips in the same breath from a structure of stone to a structure of generations. That's dabar again. Doing what dabar does, a word functioning as a living, moving thing, not a static sentence on a page. Yet David is not a clean man. He commits adultery. He arranges a death to cover it. He fails as a father more than once. If any promise in this whole story deserved to be revoked, it's this one, to this deeply flawed king. And this is exactly where Hebrew hands us the sharpest word yet. In the Psalms, God recalls this covenant with a phrase that should raise the hair on your arms. Once for all I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. Sworn. In Hebrew, shaba, to swear an oath. And that word shares its root with the number 7, Sheva, echoed in the ancient place name Beersheba, the well of the oath. To swear, in this world, was to invoke something greater than yourself as a guarantee. A king swears by his crown. A soldier swears by his life. But watch what happens when God swears. There is nothing greater than God to swear by. So what does he do? He swears by himself. Pay attention to this, because it's the hinge the entire video turns on. A letter written centuries later, reflecting back on this same pattern in Abraham's story, puts it plainly: since there was no one greater for God to swear by, he swore by himself, so that by two unchangeable things, his word and his oath, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong encouragement. Two unchangeable things: his word, his dabar, already set in motion, and his oath sworn on nothing less than his own name, because there was nothing higher available to him. This is not a story about a rainbow. This is not a story about an altar. This is not a story about a king's family line. This is a story about a God who, at every single stage, raised the cost of his own promise until there was nothing higher left to raise it to, until the only thing left to stake was himself. And that brings us back to the trench. The animals, the smoking firepot, the path. Here's the part I promised you at the start. In every other covenant-cutting ceremony in the ancient world, both parties walked the bloody path between the pieces, because both were agreeing to the same curse if they broke their word. But on that night, Abram does not walk. He cannot. He has been placed into a deep supernatural sleep, the same phrase used elsewhere in this book, only for moments when God acts entirely alone, without human help or human risk. And through the darkness, Abram watches, if watching is even the right word for a man in that kind of sleep, as a smoking firepot and a blazing torch drift between the halves of the animals. Just those two images. No hand, no face. Only fire and smoke, moving down the path alone. Most readers skim past this as strange ancient imagery and move on. Here's what most people miss. In that world, everyone watching would have understood exactly what those two symbols meant and exactly what was missing. Abram never walks, which means, in the logic of that ancient legal ceremony, only one party is accepting the penalty if this covenant is ever broken. And it is not the human being standing at the edge of the trench. It's God. God appearing as fire and smoke, the same images that will appear again on another mountain in another century when he speaks to an entire nation out of flame, takes the whole weight of that ceremony onto himself, alone, before Abram has done a single thing to deserve it, before Israel exists, before the law exists, before the temple, the kingdom, or the exile exist. At the very root of the story, God writes himself into a legal position where, if this promise ever fails, the curse falls on him and him only. Think about what that actually means for a moment. The way you'd think about it if someone did this for you personally, and you were the one standing to lose everything if the deal ever fell apart. Imagine a parent co-signing a loan for a child who could never repay it on their own, not sharing the risk, but taking the entire debt onto their own name, so that if it ever comes due and the child cannot pay, it is the parent's name on the line, not the child's. That is the shape of what happens in that trench. Except here, it isn't a debt of money. It's a debt of an entire broken relationship between God and every human being who would ever break a promise to him, which is all of us. You have probably never sat across a table from a lender and signed your name to someone else's failure before it even happened. Most of us haven't. But you know what it feels like to wait for news that decides everything, and to feel completely powerless while you wait. Sit for a second in Abram's place that night, asleep, unable to act, unable to earn anything, unable even to keep his own eyes open, while the most important transaction of his life took place a few feet away. That's not weakness on Abram's part. And if you've ever felt powerless while waiting on something you couldn't control, you already understand more of this scene than you think. That's the entire point of the scene. The promise was never going to rest on what Abram could do. It was always going to rest on what God alone was willing to carry. And centuries later, that shape reappears, this time with a name attached to it. A prophet named Jeremiah, writing while his nation is collapsing, delivers a promise unlike anything before it. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. Berith Chadashah, a new covenant. Not like the one cut at Sinai, which the people broke, almost as soon as they'd sworn to keep it. This time, God says, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. Another prophet, Ezekiel, adds the detail that finishes the picture. I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. Every covenant before this one had been written on something outside a person: a sky, stone tablets, an altar, a scroll. This one, for the first time, is written inside. Think about why that had to happen. The covenant at Sinai failed, not because the words were wrong, but because the people receiving them had nothing inside them strong enough to keep a word that's serious. You can throw blood on someone's skin, and it will wash off. You can carve a law into stone, and a heart of stone right next to it will feel nothing. So this new covenant, this Berith Chadashah, doesn't add another external sign to the pile. It goes underneath every sign that came before it and replaces the raw material of the human heart itself. That's not a smaller promise than the others. It's the largest one, because it's the only one that actually solves the problem. Every earlier promise had been circling for 2,000 years. And on the night before he died, a Jewish rabbi lifts a cup at a Passover meal in front of 12 men who have followed him for 3 years and says one sentence that ties every rung of this ladder together. This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood, the bow in the sky, the blood thrown on the altar, and the people, the oath sworn on God's own name, the fire passing alone through the pieces of dead animals so that a human being never had to. All of it resting now in a single cup, in a single night, in a single sentence. This is not a story about a number of promises to memorize. This is not a story about ancient customs you'll never use again. This is a story about a God who, from the very first pages of this book to the very last, kept raising the price of his own word until the price was his own life and paid it before you ever asked him to. So here's what to carry with you. First, a promise, in Hebrew, was never a wish. It was a dabar, a word already in motion, and a berith, cut, not signed, at real cost to somebody. The next time you read the word promise anywhere in Scripture, picture the trench, not a coffee mug. Second, every single time God escalates the seriousness of a promise in this story, from a sign in the clouds, to blood on an altar, to an oath sworn on his own name, to fire walking alone through the wreckage of dead animals, the weight moves toward him and away from you. That is not an accident of ancient culture. That is the entire direction of the whole Bible, moving one deliberate step at a time. Third, and this is the one to sit with tonight, after you close this video. If God has ever spoken a dabar over your life, a promise you've been waiting years to see, the way Abram waited years for a son, the way an entire nation waited generations for a king who would never fail them, the same God who could find no one greater to swear by than himself is the same God holding that word for you right now. He has already walked the path you were supposed to walk. Alone, which means the waiting you're doing right now is not proof the promise is failing. It's the same waiting Abram did, under the same stars, held by the same word. Which one of these 5 promises hit you the hardest? The bow, the blood, the oath, or the fire walking alone through the dark? Tell me below, because I read every single one of them, and I want to know which rung of that ladder you needed to hear tonight.